Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. I'm Jennifer Scanlon, Dean for Academic Affairs, and I'm delighted to join you for tonight's discussion in a semester-long series on the current state of American democracy and its future. The series was developed at Bowdoin following the January 6th attack on the US Capitol, a clash that serves as a stark reminder that we take our freedoms and our democracy for granted at our peril. If you missed the prior events in the series, recordings are available on the Bowdoin website. Before I introduce our guest, I want to invite you to submit questions using the Q&A tool in the bottom row of your Zoom window. After a bit of conversation with Mellody Hobson, I will incorporate some questions. Given the volume of questions, I may combine some questions, and I'm not likely to be able to address each of them to our guest. Tonight's program is 45 minutes in length. Our guest tonight is Mellody Hobson, CEO and president of Ariel Investments, and as of March, chair of the board of directors, Starbucks Corporation. She's a prominent voice in the financial community on investment strategies, the need for greater financial literacy among the general public, and how corporate America needs to reflect the increasingly multicultural nation it serves in order to thrive. She currently serves on the board of JP Morgan Chase and was a longtime board member for the Estée Lauder Companies. She was on Forbes 100 Most Powerful Women in the World list in 2020, and in 2015, Time named her as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. Please join me in welcoming Mellody Hobson. So nice to have you with us, Mellody.
Thank you so much for having me.
So Mellody, you are a national leader, a business leader, a cultural leader, a leader on politics and on race and gender and intersectionality. And a leader spends a lot of time thinking about and then communicating next steps. I know you've only had 24 hours to process the 3 counts of guilty in the trial of Derek Chauvin for the murder of George Floyd. But people across the country are eager to hear from our leaders. Recognizing that your messaging may change in the coming days and weeks, what words can you offer us tonight?
Well, I'm actually just going to my phone because I posted last night how I was feeling. And I put out a message that I think reflected my point of view at the time. What I said was today was a better day for America, better. And I don't want to overstate it, great day was a better day given what has occurred in our society. I said, tragically, George Floyd's life won't come back. We have to remember that part. It's a victory, but he won't be reborn. He won't be walking the earth with us. But his victory in death is a testament to the power of the true meaning of justice for all. That was justice for all. That's when you have the right outcome to a horrific situation. And then I ended it by saying, and yet still so much to do. And that's how I feel. That was just one small victory for a horrific murder that occurred. And when we think about the number of names of people that have been killed, the number of people who have been unjustly treated in our society, those numbers are so great. And so it's hard to do a victory lap because this is just, in the scheme of things, one small step. Giant in a lot of ways in our agreement that this treatment was inhumane and it was murder. And I was very happy to see that when polled, this is not a polarizing, or it was not a polarizing issue in our country in terms of most people agree that the outcome was the right outcome. That was heartening. But we know that this happens every day without cameras, without it being caught on film, and people die, every minute in this country for no fault of their own except for their packaging.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do still, but thank you for that. I want to ask you two questions about how corporate leaders can foster change, social change, including efforts towards racial equity, with specific reference first to corporate boards. So, some countries have racial and gender diversity mandates for corporate boards of directors. Some states in the US are moving on this. California is one example. And I think a few others are exploring some diversity measures, but it's slow. And culturally, in the US, we tend to shy away from mandates. So there's a significant body of empirical evidence, which you have cited time and again, that diversity on boards contributes not only to good governance, but also to improved financial performance. So I'm wondering, do any of the boards you've served on have mandates? And what do you think about mandates, particularly given the slow nature of change in US corporate culture?
So let's start off with the fact that I have not seen any board have a mandate. I think they have expressed goals,
Mhm.
diversity goals that they are moving towards. Some have had them around gender, some have had them around ethnicity. I've heard goals, but never a mandate stated. And I think the mandate would be challenging in some circumstances because once you put something like that in a public document, as an institution, the expectation of our regulators and the like would be that you'd have to uphold that mandate. So I think that's why mandates are hard in this country. They've been very effective in other parts of the world. And that's the thing that is so mind boggling. We think of ourselves in America as being leaders, innovators, so progressive. But when you look at board diversity, we don't rank very highly versus the rest of the world. Right now, I think about 20% of US boards represent women. But when you look at places like France, it's 40%. The UK, I think it's closer to 30%. And so one would not necessarily think that in the developed world, we would be lagging, but we are. That's not even, to talk about even when you talk about ethnicity, those numbers are even worse, especially relative to the size of the population that Black and Latinx people in this country represent. We are underrepresented on corporate boards. To give you the facts and the math more specifically, I love this line, math has no opinion. White males make up 70% of board seats in this country, but they only make up 30% of the US population. So white males are 70% of the board seats, 30% of the population. Now that was before 2020. I think the numbers will have moved then, but it still shows how far we have to go. What do I think about this issue? I think that if companies are not being thoughtful about diversity and their board composition in the 21st century, if they continue to be monolithic rooms in the company, I think the company is committing corporate suicide. And I've said that you can't be a leading company in the world and not have a diverse board or have a real agenda around diversity without at some point dying as an organization. Now, it may take a while, but I do think it will be inevitable. So I would strongly advise corporations to really think long and hard about having targets about what kind of representation do they want in the room and how do they get there over time.
Mhm. Yeah, it does seem an awfully slow, slow process. Thank
And
you.
I don't want you to have any impression that I'm comfortable with us dragging our feet. I've said this many times, we've admired these problems long enough.
Mhm.
It's time for us to start acting and doing something. There's so much lip service around diversity and inclusion. You can read it in annual reports. You hear so many people talking about this issue. But when the rubber meets the road, what has happened? We need less talk and more elbow grease on these issues.
Mhm. Well, I certainly agree. Thank you. My second question is about the role of corporations on issues of social change generally, and then we'll get to voting rights in particular. So you are now chair of the board of Starbucks. Starbucks has over 32,000 company-owned and licensed stores, and untold numbers of investors, the shareholders. As chair of the board, how do you place yourself and the rest of the board relative not only to the shareholders, but to the stakeholders, the people who live in communities where the stores are, the workers and their families, the coffee bean growers and pickers, and the consumers? How does Starbucks as a corporation foster justice?
Let me break it down a little bit from that big statement to the DNA of the company. Howard Schultz, for all the years I sat next to him in board meetings, which was 15 years, always talked about leading through the lens of humanity. If you are considering humanity, you consider humanity at every step. It's the partners that we have in the company, which is what we call the people who work in the store. It is the community that the store sits in. So we want to be good partners to the community. It's the vendors that we have who serve us and allow us to bring our wares to the market. It's how we show up in the world in other countries, that we don't go in bigfooting in other countries. We do recognize that we're invited into those communities. All of that is factored into how we run the business. And at the end of the day, we think all of those considerations enhance shareholder value. And so we do not believe in any way we're making trade-offs or we are putting one in front of the other. All of it matters. The customer experience matters, but the partner experience matters as much. If you don't have happy people working in your company, you will not have happy customers. And so leading through the lens of humanity is looking at humanity in all of its forms, in all of its ways, in all of the ways that it shows up, and taking that in consideration. And we actually do that in the boardroom. It's not easy, and it's not about anyone's personal beliefs. That's the thing that's really important. It's not my opinion or what I believe. It is what is good for humanity and the broader society. And that leads us into what we say or do. Now, I think corporate America now has a real challenge in front of it. I've been calling this time Civil Rights 3.0. I said 1.0 was the Emancipation Proclamation. 2.0 was the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. But 3.0 is where the issues as it relates to race and so many other societal issues, not just my civil rights issues, are now at the feet of corporate America. And for people who don't believe that, I give them simple examples. You have mental health benefits now in corporations. We didn't have that before. You have live shooter drills in businesses. We didn't have those things before. And it shows that corporate America can't be silent. They can't look the other way on these issues because these issues are inside of the organization. Our people are demanding and expecting us to have points of view. Our society is questioning our values. And at the end of the day, again, all of this can either enhance shareholder value or detract from it. And I'm not saying that is the be all end all of the way to do it, but there are repercussions for this, both positive and negative, in terms of the job that we do as fiduciaries for shareholders.
Mellody, could you give an example or two of where you see Starbucks or your own company, playing a leading role in any of these concerns?
I wouldn't be so bold as to call myself a leading role. I would say that I'm willing to take a stand and to have a point of view. And it has occurred on lots and lots of issues. And I think some of it is Ariel. Let's just go to Ariel, where my day job, what I do every single day is I run an investment business as co-CEO and president. It's the only job I've ever had since I graduated from Princeton. I'm the only person in my graduating class out of 1,100 people who's had the same work phone number since I graduated in 1991. 30 years in the same company. So that is where day to day I spend my time. And of course, I have these other responsibilities as chairman of the board of Starbucks and being on the board of JP Morgan and the like. But let's start with that. We were the first Black-owned investment management firm in the United States when we started in 1983. Now, I didn't start the company, but I've been there for a big part of our 38-year history. And so as a result of being the first Black-owned investment firm in the nation, people ask us questions and expect us to have a point of view. Now, that point of view, I have to be very cognizant of now. It could be interpreted as a Starbucks point of view, an Ariel point of view, and I'm trying to be super thoughtful, but I also want to be authentic and live my truth. Warren Buffett's annual letter that just came out recently, he talked about the fact that because he runs a business as CEO of Berkshire Hathaway, it did not mean that he locked away all of his rights and obligations to participate in a democratic society. I thought it was interesting how he said that. And so from our perspective, there are expectations. An example recently was expectations around the Georgia voting right issue and the voting rights laws that are suddenly spreading out around the country. And people expected us to have an opinion. And we actually had one. It wasn't one of those things you had to twist our arm to say, we don't think this is right. And so ultimately in that situation, both John Rogers and I, my co-CEO, we both spoke out in terms of a letter that was drafted for senior Black leaders in this country to sign. 72 people signed it. And both of us, without even batting an eyelash, said we will sign it too. Now, for some, it's a controversial statement. For us, it's not. This is not political. This is about just basic democracy and making sure that we all have the right to exercise what our Constitution says we get for being an American, which is the right to vote, which we know was hard fought for women and hard fought for people of color. And I always tell myself when I think about this right to vote, people died for us to have this right, literally going back to the founding of our country. They died for us in, the Boston Tea Party, the suffragettes, the civil rights movement of the 1960s. This has not been an easy won fight. And so to then have those rights jeopardized in any way, to me, compromises the democracy that we all hold to be so dear and what makes America so great. So that was one of those examples where we felt we had to say something because it is a consequential issue for our society.
So thanks. I want to say a little bit more about that and then turn to some audience questions. So, this is such an interesting moment in terms of supporting voting rights where you have people in government, and we know it's not the first time that people in government have tried to suppress voting rights. But nevertheless, we have people in government trying to suppress voting rights. And we have corporate leaders like yourself and Ken Chenault, with that letter that you reference, and Ken Chenault is a Bowdoin alum. I should just note that. And many other Black executives to step in where the government really was getting in the way of people having voting rights. So I was hoping you could say a little bit more about that, about where you see that going. So this group of leaders signed this letter. It's really valuable. It's really important to make a statement. But where do we go from here in terms of the kinds of pushback against the largest voter turnout in more than a century, pushback that's most obvious in Georgia and then in Texas, but really across the country?
No one said it was going to be one and done, and that this was going to be sign a letter and go back to work. I think we're in for a protracted struggle here. And I think this will not be easy. And I think all of us will be called upon again in different ways. It's not, again, just about a letter. It's about supporting those who are going to keep the foundations of democracy in place and ensure a fair and open system. And so I think that, can I tell you chapter and verse about every single next step? I think there is a belief that at some point, at least I believe, I want to speak for myself, Mellody Hobson, the citizen, not any hat on at this moment. I believe at some point there will be some kind of national conversation in Washington about how do we manage this. I know the constitutionalists out there will pound the table and talk about states' rights when it comes to voting. And I think that that is true, but the Voting Rights Act of 1960 eliminated some barriers to entry for people of color, and that was at a national level. So we have precedents for this. And I think that's something that we will have to see where that goes. I don't think that there's an exact set of prescriptions for solving for this yet, but I think that the situation is playing out in real time and people are reacting in real time. But I do think many of us know this will not be a short conversation. It's not like, oh, remember last April, we worked on voting rights. I think this will be something that will go on for some time, unfortunately.
Yeah, I'm sure you're right about that. I want to move to a question from the audience that's related to this question that we just talked about. So, and this is from Andy Serwer, who I understand is your friend and mine. Mellody, what would you say to the CEOs of companies in Georgia like Coke, Delta, and others, I think of Home Depot now, who found themselves facing boycotts, first from Black Lives Matter activists for not speaking out enough about the new voting laws, and then from Republicans when they do speak out?
So Andy, I appreciate that question, but I would not be so presumptuous to solve and to speak in this format in such a unnuanced way about the issues that those individual companies have confronted. What I do know, these issues are hard. And I do recognize that people are trying to do the right thing. And I think that there are repercussions for any point of view that one might have. And I don't presume to make those decisions for them as leaders. I think that they've had moments where they've put out their own statements and say where they stand. And I think that that is something that at this point, I think companies are expected to do. I think they've done that. But I think these issues they're nuanced and challenging. I don't mean to dodge the question. I just think there are circumstances and people and issues involved that make it very hard to have some blanket statement for you that will be satisfactory.
Okay. Just thinking about those same companies though, and if you're whatever they are, Coke or Delta, whoever they are, they're trying to recruit world-class employees to come to Atlanta, right, to work. This certainly does complicate that for them. To think that you might be inviting employees to come and they may face circumstances in which they actually can't exercise the franchise. So it's quite a dilemma for these companies.
But this is my point. I think this is all companies now. I think this is my point about these issues are now at the feet of corporate America. It's not just in Georgia, it's on other issues and other places. I think we have different levels of expectation now of what a company is and is supposed to be. A lot of that is tied to the viral nature of our society, that you can get the word out fast. And unfortunately, bad news travels fast in the world. And so I think this is the dilemma that exists in the boardroom, the dilemma that exists at the executive level. It's harder than it looks. And I have a lot of compassion for the decision tree that people have to think through in what to do, what not to do, where their own comfort is. I may be very comfortable being vocal on this issue because of my own experiences, and this may be a very, very authentic conversation for me. and it might be very challenging and difficult for someone else. That doesn't make them a bad person. And I think that's where our society gets a little too decisive, and that's what the nature of polarization is, that you're right, I'm wrong, finger pointing, blame. I would like to move beyond that as a society. I want to have a lot of compassion about the dilemma that a CEO has in leading, and thinking through all the constituents that they serve, and trying to make the best decision they can with the information that they have. And I do think there are moments of truth where you have to just, stand up on an issue. And I don't think companies can do that on every issue. And you've got to really pick your spot. So this is not the easiest thing. There are a lot of various agendas that are out there, so many. I do think people wake up with good intentions. That's just the nature of the person that I am. I've always tried to give, I always tell people, why do we give them the benefit of the doubt? Let's just give them the benefit with no doubt. Let's think about life in a different sort of way. And I say that without being Pollyanna-ish about it. I know the reality, everyone's not great, but you've got to start with a point of view, especially leaders in those kind of institutions at that kind of level. They didn't get there by, you know, you know, being cruel and unkind. They had to have made some good decisions and have buy-in from people who'd be willing to work with them.
Well, you have been enormously successful yourself, and you've been working at Ariel since you graduated from Princeton. Could you just tell us really briefly, and then I have a follow-up about Ariel Investments, about your first job there?
My first job, I was a summer intern. So I started in the summer. I was a nobody, just a pipsqueak. We didn't have a lot of people in the firm. We were small. And I I was in my senior year when between my sophomore and junior year, I worked at Ariel. Between my junior and senior year, I worked at T. Rowe Price in Baltimore. And then I was interviewing with all the big Wall Street firms, and I had an open offer to go back to Ariel. And one day in the middle of writing my senior thesis, I called and I said, I'm going to Ariel. And everyone was shocked. You're not going to go to one of the big Wall Street firms. And I said, why would I go to the big Wall Street firms where I'm going to be totally like layers and layers and layers away from the action? If I go to Ariel, I'm going to be right in the action, working alongside of the person who started the company and these amazing people that work with him. And I'm going to get a front row seat to American business. And that's exactly what happened. I always joke with people, I didn't go to business school because I said, why should I be reading case studies when I'm in the middle of one over and over and over again? And it ultimately has been extraordinarily fulfilling work, which is why I choose to do it every day and still wake up running to the opportunities that Ariel presents.
Well, you've obviously been enormously successful, and I want to ask you specifically about one kind of success. So I've done some reading about you and the company, and there was a point where an interviewer asked you, do you refuse to work with companies whose values you disagree with? And you said, no, I don't. We have a practice where we take people on and then we try to have an influence on them. Could you be a little more specific about that? Because that
Sure.
takes a lot of skill.
So I think the question was about the investments that we make. So
Yes.
for example, we might invest in a company that does not have a diverse board, but then we're going to lean hard in our conversations with them about why that doesn't work long term, and why, in order to be, again, a world-class 21st century company, that will need to change. Now, if we're in a situation where they really aren't listening, we have two options. Our new option that we've been defaulting to is we say we will not vote for the head of a nominations and governance committee that has a board that is not diverse. So we will vote against that leader to demonstrate that we're serious about this issue. Additionally, and that's on the domestic equity side, we have an international and global team that has their own set of criteria that they think about when it comes to environmental, social, and governance issues. So we want to use our the significance at times of our position, because we can be one of the top holders of a name to influence the company around those issues. Now it seems that's not something that we find to be controversial. So I just want to make sure we're not telling them who to hire or what to do. We're just saying the idea should be, represented in that boardroom in some way of diversity. So our idea is that we can own a company and try to influence it. Now, if we think our influence is not possible and ultimately the decisions that the company makes are bad for business, we're out. We're not activists. We're not trying to go and solicit other investors and change their point of view. We just say there are thousands of companies out there. We can find someone else. We don't need to go and convert people. So at the end of the day, I do think our influence has made a difference on the domestic equity side over the last 38 years. We can point to over 50 companies, 50, where diverse people have been added to the board as a result of our conversation, sometimes nudging, sometimes strong suggestions, sometimes pushing. And we ultimately think that made for better companies that would be more in tune to their shareholders, more in tune to their employees, more in tune to their customers, and ultimately add to shareholder value.
Thank you. I'm going to go back to the audience and ask you a question that comes in from Dave Bean. What measures or actions has your firm taken to educate Black individuals on money management, and what obstacles do you see to improving participation of Black Americans in this sector?
I love this question because financial literacy is such a big part of our work.
Mhm.
What we did a few years ago, I would go to all these rooms and speak. And again, I'm a pipsqueak. It's 30 years ago, 25 years ago. And one of the things John Rogers and I noticed when we were in general audiences, they weren't diverse. And we started to think about that and really the implications of that long-term for society. We tried to help some of the big firms understand that we needed to create opportunities to democratize investing. So what I mean by that is there were companies, they were famous companies, big companies, but if it was a $10,000 minimum, that would be a barrier to entry potentially for Black and Latinx people who wanted to benefit from the power of compounding when it came to investing in the stock market. And it's interesting to see how that world has evolved so much now. There's so many companies now where you can buy slivers of shares and you can invest your change. And we love the fact that that access has been opened up and creates greater opportunity for participation in the US capitalist system. So that's great. So what we did to try to prove to them that we really were onto something is we started doing surveys. So we created the first of its kind Black investor survey back in 1998. And we wanted to create the survey. We surveyed African Americans who made $50,000 in income and higher to be able to demonstrate that there was a market there. And I would go to people and I'd say, when you think about all areas of business, whether it's a B2C, business to consumer business, I can show you where the businesses have started to target market. But we hadn't seen that kind of target marketing in the financial services arena. McDonald's and Coke started target marketing 40 years ago with ads that were to Latinx or Black people, et cetera, as a way of getting our attention, and it worked. They created a lot of customer loyalty. But you didn't see that in the financial services arena because of a lot of opinions and perhaps unsubstantiated information about African Americans, Latinx Americans in terms of us having the means to invest. So we started to do the survey. The survey found that we were woefully underinvested versus our white counterparts making the same amount of money. And there were 5 reasons for it from the very beginning. So we found there were 5 reasons African Americans were underinvested at that level. And we looked all the way up the income scale, over $100,000. And again, the data sustained itself all the way up the income scale. So it wasn't about the amount of money. So it was knowledge was keeping us from investing. 2/3 of us said we didn't invest because we didn't know enough. Misinformation. We had bad facts. Like, if I invest, I won't have access to my money. No matter what I invest in, there'll be high penalties for withdrawal. Trust, super, very, very significant trust issues. First of all, we were like, where is Wall Street? Just something that basic versus a bank with a passbook savings account, which isn't going to outpace inflation. At least we could go visit our money. Exposure. A lot of us had not been exposed. If you don't grow up in a home where the stock market is discussed, you are behind the 8 ball because we don't learn about those issues in school in America. And I tell audiences all the time, it boggles the mind that in high school in America today, you can take wood shop and auto and not a class on investing, which always leads me to ask people the same questions. Who whittles in their spare time? Who's cleaning their own carburetor? No one, right? But you can't take that essential course that will tell you max out on your 401k plan. And then last, we tend to be more conservative. That makes total sense. You have so many Black and Latinx people who are making money for the first time. And we're not going to jump head first into something we don't know or understand. So knowledge, misinformation, trust, exposure, and a culture of conservatism. And then we started to build on that survey over time. Now we do it every 5 years. And then we even went and looked at 401k plans and how people are invested. And I tell people, this is not a Black issue, because they'll say, well, what does that have to do with me? Do with me? And I explain to them, here's the story. This is how this all pans out. You've been working hard your whole career. You've saved and invested appropriately. The Black person in the cube right next to you making the same amount of money didn't have that same information to make those decisions for a host of reasons. And at the end of the day, they're behind the 8 ball, retiring with much less than you are. Ultimately, that person becomes a burden on society, which comes out of your pocketbook when it comes to taxation. So it is in your interest, and is in the interest of the whole society for us to have a financially literate society. And so we have a lot to do to get there, including having financial literacy in school, which is something we've done at Ariel.
Thank you. And I mean, the generational implications of this are profound.
Well, that's also where you create the vicious circle. So we ask questions in our surveys like, what do you plan to do in retirement? African Americans have a totally different point of view of what retirement is. So when we asked white Americans making over $50,000, they said, spend more time with family, travel, volunteer. When we asked Black Americans making over $50,000 what they plan to do in retirement, they said consult, start a business, get another job. For Black people, we didn't have the same even perception of retirement because many in our community work until we die. Now let's just go to something as basic as that enrollment kit in a 401k plan. I tell my peers in the financial services community, how many of us have seen that picture of that beautiful white couple in their late 60s, early 70s walking on the beach? I have not seen a lot of those pictures with Black and brown people. And so we see the materials and we don't even think it's for us. So there are so many ways that we can skin this cat to create the opportunity for us to catch up with our white counterparts. Now, the good news is the survey we just did, it showed that we are talking about this issue. When we started, we said, we want to make the stock market a subject of dinner table conversation in the Black community. Well, during the pandemic, Black and Latinx people were more likely to be talking about investing in money than their white counterparts. And that was a first. And that's progress.
That is definitely progress. Thank you. I want to go to a question about young people from Renee Anderson. What do you believe are some of the most important things for students or entry-level professionals to do to promote diversity and inclusion within their realm of influence, i.e., not yet in roles of leadership?
So I believe everyone's a leader. I believe everyone has power. And the example that I give all the time is a super simple one. Rosa Parks just decided not to get up. She had no discernible power or influence, and she changed a paradigm at that point when it came to just where we were allowed to sit in a bus in the South. So understanding you have power, I think, is very, very important. I think the biggest mistakes young people make is they think all diversity and inclusion conversations should come from on high and some kind of policy that will be, you know, put upon them. And I ask, what is your role in this conversation? What trees do you plant? Where is your voice? That doesn't mean you have to go in being militant, but it does mean that you can ask questions and you can push for inclusion. I give this simple example. My firm is a minority firm. When I was young and new at Ariel, I remember being in a meeting with some of my colleagues who who were white men, and we were pitching business. And I remember we were sitting there and I wrote on a piece of paper, make eye contact with the woman. They didn't realize they weren't doing it. And as a woman sitting there watching, I could see they'd assumed the power were the men in the room. I had no standing, but the one thing we all wanted was the account. So that wasn't a reprimand. It was like, we're going to be more successful if you make eye contact with the woman and you don't realize you're not doing it. Now I say that, and I want to make sure it's very clear. I didn't think my colleagues were bad people. I think that's a function of exposure and experience. And John Rogers used to explain that to me all the time. He would say to me, Mellody, they've never met anyone like you. You have to give them a minute. It doesn't mean being complacent or satisfied with not being treated well, but it means you don't go in with guns blazing. You help people to see where they're falling short. And I think young people today are formidable. I think that they speak their truth. And I think that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. I don't think, again, you have to do it with blame placing or in a polarizing way. You could ask, I think the most effective way to affect change is asking questions. There's a difference between declarative statements that put people on the defensive and a question that maybe will help them to see the error of their ways. So just understand your power.
Understand your power. That's a great concept. And I think our students, Bowdoin students, are really exploring that. So Mellody, we started out talking about race and about George Floyd, and I'd like to end with a question about race as well. So I've seen a few interviews where you talk about your mother and the tremendous influence that she had on your life. When you'd be a lone Black girl in an event with white children, she'd ask you, how did they treat you? And now you're a parent. What is your daughter likely to remember about how you do and will talk with her about race?
That I started early and I talked to her about it often, and that I want her to be socialized to the fact that she is a Black girl child in this country. And even though she has a white father, what people see is the Black. And so I want her to be very, very comfortable and aware of who she is. And I tell her what my mother told me, which was, you can be or do anything. She certainly is growing up with much different resources and much different opportunities. And I really believe that's true. But I also believed it was true. And my mother told me the same thing, and we had much less. But I have taken it a step further, and I say this in a lot of my speeches, that I also tell her, I want you to believe that's true of anyone and everyone. That's my new piece of my advice to my child. I want her to look out into the world, look and see people, and believe anything is possible for them too. And I think if we have that lens through which we look at all of the people we confront on a day-to-day basis in our lives, we will change the paradigm in this country and in the world.
That's great. Thank you so much for that. Mellody, I read somewhere that you've been described by someone who knows you well in this way. Mellody is not a networker, she's a magnet. So I think that's really an apt description. And thank you so much for your magnetic energy tonight. Thanks for holding this space for Bowdoin College tonight. And thank you for everything that you do.
Well, thank you for having me, and please know I appreciate all of the students that are out there that are trying to find their place in the world and who have yet to do amazing things. So I wish them very, very good luck.
Thank you so much. And to our audience, thank you for joining us tonight. Thanks to the President's Office for sponsoring this series, and to the Donald M. Zuckert Class of '56 Fund for supporting these conversations. If you'd like to know more about this series of conversations, which concludes tonight, please visit the Bowdoin website at bowdoin.edu. Thank you and have a good night.